Welcome everyone. I just wanted to start by saying that we do have closed captioning available through this webinar. You can click on the CC button in your toolbar if you would like to enable that tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name is Siri, and I'll be here as your host for tonight's inquiry series, a virtual speaker series designed to explore inclusivity. This program features sessions with leaders from the outdoor recreation and education sector who are paving the way towards a more diverse and inclusive outdoor community. Before we dive into tonight's session, I wanted to let you know, again, that we are recording this webinar to be shared for further viewing on our website. So for tonight, I'm super excited to welcome our guest, Kareem Neal. Kareem is a self-contained special education teacher in Phoenix, Arizona. He is the recipient of the 2019 Arizona Teacher of the Year Award and was recently awarded an honorary doctorate from Northern Arizona University for his contributions to special education. This is just a few of his many gifts and accomplishments, and we are so excited to bring Kareem onto the series to help us shift our focus a bit and work with us in expanding and exploring the concept of inclusion from his experience in the education world, which is so critical when we consider inclusion in outdoor education and outdoor learning. There will be time at the end of the webinar for question and answers, so feel free to submit questions either through the chat or through the Q&A function, and I will read them for you. So without further ado, Kareem, go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you very much, Siri. Pleasure to be here, everyone. Thanks for having me. I want to say, one, that it's really good to present at 8 o'clock. I am on the East Coast right now. I'm in New Jersey, and I am like a night person. So presenting at 8 o'clock is so good. I love it. I like come alive at night. So I'm ready to go. I'll throw some quick other background, although I realize my resume on paper sounds really cool, but I have been teaching for 24 years now. Most of it in Phoenix, Arizona, where I live. So I'm in New Jersey visiting my family right now, but I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I've always been self-contained special education, a couple times in self-contained, our special schools, they call them. So my first school in New Jersey for 3 years, and then my first school in Arizona for 6. They were all special schools. And then I moved on to kind of a traditional high school, and that's where I've been the last 14 years or so. And that's kind of when I started thinking about what I like to call true inclusion. I tried to like trademark it jokingly in a conference that I was doing. And people said, you should do that, but I don't even know how to do that. And I don't care if someone else uses it, but that is what I call it. And the reason why it came about was kind of because of how I started teaching and how I transitioned into teaching in kind of traditional high school. The high school I teach at now has 3,000 students, very large high school. It is a school that has 2 self-contained classes. And I kind of came from a world in which all students, because of special schools, all students had significant cognitive, what they called at the time, cognitive delays or special needs, of course. And it was really comfortable being in that world. And when I moved to kind of a traditional school, it wasn't so comfortable. And me and my crew kind of built this really good home, me and my classroom. And I have a couple paraprofessionals in my classroom, 3 paraprofessionals. They are amazing. And I have about 16 students. Right now, I usually have between 15 and 19. And then it's us. And my students, self-contained means that the students don't travel. So they could possibly be in my class all day. A few of my students have electives. All of my students have PE, which is great, actually. I wish all students had PE. I can't lie, I'm one of those people. But all of my students do get PE because it's the only way they can give me a prep period. So that all my students in the paras go there for PE. But anyway, teaching in a setting like that, I had the opportunity to really be apart from the school. And I did that for a while because I was very comfortable. But when I started kind of pushing past that, and I actually started through a camp that I now lead, I did it as a volunteer. It was a camp for social justice at our school. It's called Panther Town. My school is the Maryville Panthers. And so I went to this camp, and it was amazing. And we talk about all those, things that kind of separate people, right? Race and gender and ability. And when I went, I was like, this is great. It's like up in the kind of the colder mountain area in Arizona, right? And I loved it. And I said, this is the perfect opportunity for me to reach a lot of the kind of general ed students and have them at least meet my students, because my students really are on an island and they wanted to meet their peers, and they really wanted to be a bigger part of the school and they weren't. So I'm going to dive into kind of my last stages of it. I've been honing this the last couple of years as I've been trying it in my classroom. I do love to be the kind of speaker who can say, this is my experience on that. I know a lot of educators who become public speakers wind up leaving the classroom. I'm refusing. I'm like holding on pins and needles. I won state teacher of the year in Arizona, and it's odd because that happens and then everybody wants you to not be a teacher anymore. It's like, you should do this, you should do that. And I'm like, huh, I thought the teaching was my thing, right? So I'm still doing that thing. And I'm gonna share my screen now and dive into the presentation. Making sure this works. Please let me know if my screen is not sharing. From here, it's looking like I'm good to go. Yes?
It looks great, Kareem, yep.
Okay, cool. All right, and I am going to go ahead and move straight to the second the second page. And so this quote I like to give no matter what I'm presenting on. I actually present sometimes on restorative justice. I'm a restorative justice trainer. I love that. I was speaking of which, because restorative justice kind of came from the Native American people, I do want to give a shout out and land acknowledgement. I am on Lenape land right now, although I'm normally not, because I'm normally in Arizona, but this is Lenape land right here in New Jersey. And so this quote, across the country definition of inclusion is offered. I don't want to read it out to y'all because it's quite a bit and I've been talking a bit already, but I would love if y'all can take a screenshot of. I will send this presentation to whoever, and my PowerPoint, which I did not send them. I'll send this out to you also if you ever wanted a copy, but go ahead and take a picture, a screenshot if you are on your phone. But this, it embodies so much, but what I really, love by kind of the concept of inviting other people in. When we think about inclusion, almost always we kind of think about settings in education. At least we think about settings where general ed classes and classrooms have special education students come and they either watch, sometimes they're in that classroom as a student and they have a helper with them. Sometimes maybe a few students are in that class. Every once in a while, there's co-teaching classes where there's a regular ed teacher and a special ed teacher. That's the newest iteration of it. But all of the iterations of it are one-sided in my opinion, and that there's always kind of the invitees as opposed to us all just being a part of this school and us all having value in what we do. And the reason why I say that is because there's no model of inclusion in which general ed students or gifted students come to special education classrooms and learn anything. And the thought of there's a community of people that we can't learn anything from is a super flawed thought, right? Like I think about when I started my career teaching, it started actually when I was a junior in college. I was a chemical engineering major. My undergrad was chemical engineering, and I know it's a weird road to become a special education teacher, but I volunteered, kind of volunteered. I was working at my gym at Seton Hall, which was the university I went to in New Jersey. And they had a Special Olympics event and I was putting the hurdles and all the things together for the adaptive equipment for them together. And one of the coaches said to me, would you mind coming over and talking to the kids? They're really interested by how tall you are. So I'm 6'7", you can't tell now because I'm sitting down, but I'm super, super tall human. And I'm one of those people who get asked about whether I play basketball every time I'm walking the streets. I'm like, man, doesn't the gray hair tell you that I'm no longer a basketball player? I'm an old guy who just hangs in my house and watches TV. But anyway, I came over and I met like the most authentic humans I had met at the time, right? I'm a junior in college. Everybody talks the same, dresses the same. We all listen to the same music. and I meet these athletes for the Special Olympics who were like, you know, there was a guy wearing a cape. There were students who were just like, you know, they met me and they were just like, you know, you're really cool. I love you, right? Hugs. They were, you know, they were boys. And at the time, you know, as a junior in college and you're a boy, that's something that you don't do. And it was just this really different world of these really authentic people that I were like, I want to be a part of that. And immediately decided I was going to change my major. I couldn't at the time. I was a junior, second semester junior, but I did go straight to graduate school for special ed, right? And doing that, when I look back and I started talking about like my journey when I won Teacher of the Year, right? Everybody wants to hear now about, they care about you all of a sudden when you win an award, right? And I talked about how much I get from teaching students with special needs, right? Like how much joy, how much about living in the now, how much about being authentic, right? That I learned from these folks. And I realized in that typical, you know, that typical version of inclusion, that schools were essentially saying there's academic levels. And if you are in an academic level that's not quite as high as some other folks, you need to learn from them, right? Which sounds fine, right? But it was never, even though schools are constantly talking about social and emotional learning and things like that, right? How to be a better person. There was never a, hey, what are the things we can learn from these classes, these special education classes? Maybe we can do the same, a more reciprocal type situation. And so that's why, you know, this quote where it says the universal oneness and interdependence, it's, if there's schools or there's spaces, like a lot, I think a lot of what y'all are doing is outdoor spaces and including people in that. When there's spaces that people are left out of, we are not getting the full experience no matter what. So if you think that the only way a student can be benefited in school is to go to a higher level academic subject, you're off. That is not how that works, right? Schools are more than just places where you learn math, reading, science, and social studies. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about right now, how to do it, how it looks. All right, so community being sacred. So I talked a bit about how I'm a restorative justice trainer, and that really informs a lot of what I do, because one of the principles of restorative justice is just building community, right? And in building community, you get to know what all the people in your community need. And with that, it starts to take away some of your bias, right? So we all have some bias, whether it be little, whether it be the big ones, right? And I know it's something that, you know, now it seems that our country never wants to talk about any of our biases, our mistakes, our shortcomings, but we all do have them. And one of the ways that we work to eliminate them is building stronger communities, whether it be a classroom, right? So that was what I was always good at. I was always good at building a classroom community. 16 students, 4 paraprofessionals, and me, and we were like a family. And it was always beautiful, all of my classes, right? But we had never really brought that to the full school. And the school was like most schools. It was just, oh, the gifted folks are over there. The gen ed folks are over here. The special ed folks are over here. You know, and even to worse points, right? It's like in the cafeterias, right? The white students are over there. The black students are over there. The Asian students are over there, right? All of that stuff that happens, we need to build community to stop that stuff from happening, right? And building a stronger school community through equity and inclusion kind of doesn't just happen by us saying we're okay with special ed students going to a regular ed classroom. That doesn't really do that thing. What it tends to do, and what I've seen it do, is it has the gen ed students feeling like there's a hierarchy, like they are here and the students with special needs are under them and they're to help them, right? And that's a really flawed concept, particularly when they're their peers in age, right? So they're saying to another person, right? So example of a 12th grade student saying, oh, I'm here to help this 12th grade student. And then I also saw the students in special education classrooms looking up to the students in gen ed classrooms, because that's what it did. That is what that hierarchy did. It said, oh, we can be every once in a while invited into a regular ed classroom because those classrooms are better. And the fact that no one was coming to our classrooms let us know that our classrooms weren't the place to be. And it starts to make you say, oh, there is a hierarchy. Those are the students who are cool, who I want to befriend, et cetera, not the other way, right? So then the gen ed students are not saying, I want to befriend the special ed students. Why would they think that, right? They were never called upon to learn anything from them, to do anything other than to teach them and help them. And that kind of created that hierarchy. And so, you know, my last bullet point here was, how can a one-sided system be fair, and what can we do about it? It can't be fair. Like we think it is. It's like, oh, okay, there's this, when you think about kind of the concept of inclusion, like, oh, there's a student in my class, right, who gets essentially specialized instruction, right, in math or reading, right? And if they do really well, they could potentially go to a less self-contained environment to learn some math and reading, which is great. I can't lie, that's a great concept. The only problem is it's always that. It is never the other way, and so it's one-sided. And if it's one-sided, it is not helping you build community, and it is not helping those students all feel like they're all the same, right? They're all kind of working together for one goal, which is to make the school better. Like our goal is all to make schools better. It's not just to like learn math, reading. It's to learn, sure, but you're not even getting a full learning experience if you're not checking out what the students in special education classrooms are doing. All right. Sorry about the AC, it's kind of loud. I'm hoping that's not messing my voice up. Let's hope not. I'm good.
You're good, Kareem. We can't hear it.
I am good. That's good. Okay. So I talked about the typical model of inclusion already, right? Students in special ed programs, particularly self-contained, they sit in, they take certain regular ed classes. It is great. I would never want to discount that system or take that system away ever. But the next part is gen ed students never sit in special education classrooms unless it's an individual student acting as a helper. So a lot of schools have TAs, they call them like that, teacher assistants or student assistants. That happens all the time in a standard schools, you know, special ed programs. So what this model leads to the hierarchy that I talked about, and it affects the way peers feel about their special ed peers. And when I think about my schooling, and all of you here can take a moment and think about your schooling, think about how these special education students in your high school, let's go to high school, fit. I won't even say college because most colleges don't even have special ed students there. But think about in your high school, how did most special education students fit? And the reason why I bring that up is because in my high school, I didn't even know them. Like I didn't meet one of them. I left high school in my first 3 years of college until that special ed event without having met any person with a significant cognitive delay at all. Not one person with Down syndrome, not one person with autism, not one person with a multiple learning disability. And I'm wondering if your schools were similar, and if they were not similar, how were they? I have a feeling though, that none of you were learning anything from any of the special ed students, and that I feel is the problem. All right, I'm gonna move on. Okay, so what schools can be? So schools can be connected and collaborative by teachers offering up different opportunities for classroom swapping, sharing, observing. And again, this could certainly be related to the world outside of school. But just thinking about how opportunities are given and what they look like. And so I'm going to bring up classroom swapping or observing. So what was happening right around the time I won State Teacher of the Year, right? It was like, oh, all of a sudden, like lots of people knew me, particularly on my campus, of course, right? And you know, they had the parties, the balloons, and my classroom was great. And so teachers started saying, hey, it would be really cool if we had your students come to our classroom and do a project together. And they were always like games, right? It was always like, oh, come to our class, we're building kind of the, you know, the toothpick houses, or you know, we're doing games with koosh balls or whatever the case may be. And I was always like, sure, bring my kids over. I always thought it would be really great opportunities for my students to interact with some of their gen ed peers because they don't get many opportunities to interact. But I started saying, well, what I'm going to need for you is for you to come into my class one day, for you to bring your students to my class, and they can learn some things. I knew that was different. I actually have a tool for that I'm going to give to you at the end of my presentation. I knew that was going to be different, right? A regular ed teacher brings their kids in and just sit there and listen to one of my lessons, which is of course a super, modified version of kind of their lessons. But I gave all the people instructions on some of the things that their students could look for. And those were the social interactions that my students had, the willingness for my students to make a mistake and then try again, right? So a lot of the things that I knew was missing from the average gen ed class, general ed class or regular ed class, whatever you want to call it, was in those kinds of classes. It's a bunch of students on an island, right? And most of them were kind of trying not to be seen a lot of the times, right? It's maybe like one or two kids who like raise their hand for every question. Everyone else is sitting there quietly hoping they're not called upon, right? And I wanted them to see that it was a totally different way that did not come with any kinds of stigma. And I think that was the issue, right? In regular ed classes, some student raises their hand, takes a chance and misses a problem. And then they're worried how their peers are going to view them. Are they going to view them as not as bright? Are their teachers going to view them as not as bright, right? And in my class, I have students who almost all raise their hands for a question. And if they miss a question, they're almost all just as likely to raise their hand for the next question because they know it's this really kind of caring and connected atmosphere. And I knew that most special ed classrooms were like that. It's a bunch of kids, they loved coming to school, they loved their staff. It was really fun stuff. Education and social emotional learning kind of went hand in hand. And I knew that wasn't happening in regular classrooms. So I was telling these teachers when they come, look for that kind of stuff. Have your students look for some of the differences they see in the classroom, some of the similarities. And I didn't want them to see that, like, right? It was like, no, these students are your peers and they are feeling, thinking, and acting much in the same way that you act, right? You think maybe they're different because they have special needs, but they're a lot like you. However, there is lots that can be learned from them, and that's what I want them to do. And I kind of guide them on how to do those things. And I think that's essential in kind of creating these spaces that are different from the spaces that we're also used to, right? Whether you are doing a camp, like I think of the camp that I went to, I started slowly integrating some of the special ed students to the camp. It was tough, right? We went away for 5 days, and think about like any of your kids, if y'all have kids out there, to think, oh, going away for 5 days, always a stressful situation. And I think based on the way that kind of society views it, but even many parents and things like that, like special ed students are more fragile and things like that. So they weren't coming to my camp. Well, I was like, I need to change that if I'm going to do this thing wholeheartedly, right? If I'm going to truly build these communities. So I started I started talking to the parents I was really close to, like, please, I have my phone on me at all times. You can talk to them, but we need some of them to come to camp. And when they got there, right, it was just like, okay, regular ed students were immediately trying to help them because it's the only thing that their minds had learned, right? They had never even thought like, hey, what are some of the things I can get by talking to this person who has special needs? What kinds of things can I learn from that person? And I knew it was up for me to say, students, these are some of the things you can look for so that you can start that journey on figuring out like, oh, there's a lot that I can gain from being around folks who have learning differences that I couldn't gain from being around my regular ed peers. And I should look for that and value that. And then it becomes easier for them to value the person. All right. And so I also wrote the schools should be at places that don't feel like a caste system where everyone feels like they're equally centered. And I use the word centered a lot, like I said, in all of the presentations I give, but schools are like that too, right? There is a gifted program. There's a gen ed program, and there's a special ed program in almost every every typical high school in the country. And I'm sure middle school, elementary, I won't speak to them because I haven't worked at those, but I do know that there are special ed classes in those schools. I do know there are gifted classes in those schools, and I know there are gen ed classes in those schools. And I would assume They're much like the kind of caste system that I see in my school. And I wanted to change it. And so I started taking steps to do that, because what do you do when you want to change something? It needs to be you. It needs to not be waiting for other people. When I talk to teachers on this presentation, I don't know if there are any teachers out there listening to this presentation, but when I talk to teachers, I say, just start doing this. Don't start asking admin for ways to do it, because it'll take them months of paperwork to figure out whether it's okay to have regular ed kids and special ed classrooms, and it's a mess. I just started doing it and then told them about it after the fact, like, oh, it works out perfectly, to make things easy. And I think, action is what we have to all be about in decentering spaces, not just classroom spaces. All right. So actionable steps in school. So I talk about shared classroom experiences the most, because that is the thing that people are not seeing ever. Right? When I talk about Special Olympics, people understand. Unified may be a little bit different, but we'll get into it. Best Buddies, same thing. A lot of people who work in schools know what Best Buddies are. I'm going to explain them in a second. But shared classroom experiences is the thing that's not happening on an equal level, right? It's happening all in a one-sided way. So the Unified Special Olympics, I want to talk about them real quick, because they're amazing. So I told you, by attending a Special Olympics event, and it was a super traditional Special Olympics event. It was a bunch of staff members, a bunch of athletes who had special needs, some physical, some mental, and they were playing their sports against each other and with each other, right? Unified Special Olympics, though, it has to be an equal number of athletes who have learning differences and special needs with students who don't, right? So it has to be the equal amount of gen ed, regular ed, whatever you want to say, and special ed folks together. And Unified Special Olympics are in every state. So I just don't know how big they are in each state. And that's kind of a thing that I've seen needed to be contended with. In Arizona, it's getting there. And I do know that I've been kind of a part of that, because I fortunately got this kind of big platform on my state. And I've been talking about it. So then, the state's been responding. But Unified Special Olympics, it's amazing. It just means that two people are working together at all costs. It is not set up in a way that says there's regular ed folks helping special ed folks. It is just, you need to have equal amount of regular ed and gen ed folks on any teams that's an event is being held, and that event will be played by those folks. That's it. There is no real standard. And so, and we're deep into it, of course, at my school, as y'all would expect, based on the fact that I'm doing this. But our state is relatively big, and when we go to the meets, it's amazing, because it is truly this blend where they stop thinking about, like, oh, are you in the regular ed class and you're in the special ed class? It's just we're all together playing a sport, and then we all eat together, and we all ride the bus together. And that is kind of how you have more kind of these experiences that I want all students to have that they don't get a chance to have. Best Buddies. So Best Buddies is an actual club, but it is also in every state. And it is, now that is specific to schools. Unified Special Olympics is not. That is outside of schools. That is for adults. That is for school members and all. But Best Buddies is specific to schools. And it is a program that says regular ed folks, special ed folks are the people who put together a club. They work it together. They hang out at lunch. They hang out at field trips together. It is not kind of like sporting events. It is all events. It is just, oh, there's going to be a pep assembly. Let's the Best Buddies clubs have some members be in an assembly, and we'll sit together, right? And so it's the same kind of a vibe where regular ed kids, special ed kids are blending together in a more natural way than kind of these inclusive classes that I talked about, these inclusion models. And then shared school spaces. The reason I brought that up, because I've been talking a lot about kind of shared classroom spaces, but shared school spaces matter a great deal also. And why I say that is, again, if you think back to your educational experience, or maybe even your son or daughter's educational experiences, if you have those, think about like assemblies. Where were the special ed students? They were probably, seated in a special place. they were probably not really participants in assemblies. Did the special ed class put on any assemblies? Like my class, we've actually put on assemblies, right, for the school to see. And so that's a shared space, right? Are they going to the games? Are they going to baseball, football, basketball games and things like that? You know, is lunch 10 minutes earlier for the special ed folks, like a lot of schools, including how my school was when I started there. And then the regular ed folks coming after that and the special ed folks eating in their classrooms, right? It needs to be all spaces are open for all people to enjoy at the same time. Again, to get that stigma out of people's head, right? It is, we all can learn from each other. Just because we learn differently do not mean we're not peers. And that's what I really want people to understand, that they're all peers. All right. Things to look for. So this is really interesting. And when I talk to parents of folks with special needs, this is what I talk about first: true friendships. And why I think it's important is because that's how you know it's happening, right? So whether it sounds like y'all are doing, of course, outside programming, are the, you know, folks who have learning differences and special needs, are they interacting with gen ed folks, but really? So what happens when I remember when I first started at my school, my students would often come back from PE because PE, like my students' PE class would be near kind of the gen ed students' PE class. And then lunch, even though we did the 10 minutes early when I first started there, I started kind of saying, this is crap for my first year. And so my kids were sitting at lunch with people. And so my students were often coming back and saying, that's my best friend, John, right? And they tell me all about this person. I think it's the greatest thing ever. I was like, this is cool. My kids have really good friends who were not in special ed classes. I think that's great. Only problem was when I would see one of those folks, oh, John, hey, John, you're the John my kid talks about all the time, right? My student talks about you all the time. Sounds like your friend. He's like, yeah, he's really cool. And I was like, oh, do y'all ever hang out outside of school? Oh, never. Right? Do y'all have each other's phone numbers? No. Do you ever, you know, on the weekends, are y'all, you know, playing video games online together maybe? No. And so I started saying to parents, and I'll say this even to y'all, if y'all have programs that have both gen ed and regular ed folks, gen ed and special ed folks together, are there true friendships being built, or is it a bunch of special ed folks looking up to the regular ed folks and liking them a lot? And the regular ed folks saying, oh, they're great, and paying them no real mind and only hanging with their regular ed peers, right? And so I started saying, parents, if your kids are coming home and telling you they have a good friend at school, but you never meet them, hear from them, or see them even online, then that means they're not their good friends. That again is this one-sided relationship. And I started looking for those kinds of actual friendships where it was, you know, like I had a student go to the prom with another student, right? It was like as a friend, it was, they were like, oh, I don't have a date. You don't have a date, let's go. And that's a real friendship. Not, I want to go to the prom and help you out. It was just like, they talk all the time. They both wanted to go to prom and they didn't have a date. So they went together. And that's like a true friendship, right? Or like I have a student, Sean, who plays video games constantly. Like every weekend when I say, what did you do? He played video games all weekend. But he's playing online now with the gen ed kid that he hangs out with sometimes at school. And I was like, now that's a different kind of friend. That's a real friendship. That is a two-sided friendship. And what we get and feel comfort with is, oh, the gen ed folks are cool with the special ed folks. So that's good enough. But that's not good enough. It needs to be true relationships being built, and that's what we need to be looking for. So in whatever situation you're in, whether you're, like I said, if you're a parent, you have school age kids, if you're running a program that has regular ed and special ed kids, to see if the friendships are true. They are not one-sided. Like I talked about earlier, there's a bunch of one-sided relationships happening. I don't want this thought of, oh, they're inviting them and they're allowing the special ed kids to hang with them for a little while. It's just like, no, they want to. They want to hang with them. They have true friendships. And next, I went with teacher collaboration. And again, I think this can apply to workspace collaboration. Unified Special Olympics, same kind of vibe. Is it the gen ed folks running it, right? Is it the typical people are doing all the stuff and saying we are allowing you to be a part of that? Or are you saying, no, you got to jump into my space also, right? So when I think of, a true community, it is not just, oh, it's run this way, and all the gen ed folks are going to do all the real tasks, and the special ed folks are going to just get to hang and sit there. And it needs to really be this two-sided thing where all ideas are being shared from both groups of people, and also the groups of leaders who are conducting it are kind of having a person, who's a real special ed advocate or a special ed teacher like me or something like that, having that person have an equal voice. And then uptick the opportunities for special ed classes. And again, this could not be for classrooms, but to host events and activities. So again, leading activities, not just participating in or seeing them, thinking of and creating activities. All of these things can be done. They're just not given a chance to be done all the time. And so that's kind of the things I think we need to see happen to say that we have an inclusive environment. To say you have an inclusive environment because there are people there with and without disabilities is not the case. It's just people who are hanging out at the same space. But if those people are all equally involved, then it is inclusive. If the special ed folks have voices, just like the gen ed folks, if the special ed folks have opportunities to lead, like the gen ed folks. The conference I went to in Minnesota, which is why I'm going back. It was the best conference I went to that year, and I went to like 100. It's the Minnesota Down Syndrome Association. And their conferences are every November, which is a little cold for my Arizona self, but I made it there, right? But the beauty of their conference is, so I was a keynote speaker at their conference, which is kind of how your group found me. And the other keynote was a woman with Down syndrome. And I thought that was fantastic, right? Like the thought of there's this whole association dedicated to folks with Down syndrome. And then this guy who does not have Down syndrome is kind of the highlighted speaker there. To me, once I saw what happened, I was like, oh, that is ridiculous that it would just be me. And I love that, we had two keynotes, and the other keynote, by the way, was much more amazing to me. It was a person with the first person with Down syndrome to like swim the English Channel. It was amazing. She was amazing, and her speech was amazing, and I felt bad following it up. But there also was breakout sessions that folks with Down syndrome led. And that was it. So they got it right. And that's why I was just like, whatever y'all need, I'll always be there. I'll always make the flight to Minnesota and freeze my buns off, because they got it right. And that's what I'm hoping that the world starts to see, right? So if you're running an outdoor program and you're having two groups there, please have the special ed folks have a chance to have a real voice, real opportunities to lead, because they totally can do it. All right, so I have this tool, and the reason why I thought the tool was important is because when you start this, right, whatever you're doing, and so like I said, it sounds like y'all will be doing lots of outdoor programming, and when you start inviting in special ed, it sounds like y'all already do that as well. But if you're going to kind of take it to the level of, all right, these special ed folks have a unique voice. They have a point of view that we all need to hear and share. You will need a tool. And why you need that tool is because it's something that we don't do and we don't know normally, right? So when I go into a person's classroom, a gen ed classroom with my students who have special needs, we go into the classroom and I already know what it's going to be, because this has been a history of inclusion, right? So we go in and they have, whatever academic subject they're studying, and we're usually studying the same thing. They're usually kind of doing some higher level thinking type stuff, right? And so my students kind of sit and learn with them, sometimes in groups. Like I said, it's always some games. There's usually like a video or a movie or something like that. And so when I started having them come to our classrooms, it was, all right, are we just going to do I was sitting there kind of talking to the powers in my class, because the powers in my class are essential, right? And we were like, what do we do to make sure they get what I'm trying to give them, right? Not just, oh, they came, sat in my classroom and they took over, just like they would in their classes, because that happens sometimes, right? It's like if I didn't kind of have if I didn't have some sort of guidance, the gen ed folks were going to come to my classroom, sit at a table with my students and start telling my students answers and guiding them and helping them with their work. And my students would have fallen into that. So I said, no. They're coming in, and these are kinds of some of the things they need to look for, right? So they're observing, they're following the lead of my students. And so I gave them this tool, and I feel like, again, this is the kind of reflection tool that can be used in different spaces, right? How are people different? How are people the same? And I love that always. And I think about, I do a lot, and I think a lot of people do a lot of stuff with race recently, right? This last year, it was like, with the George Floyd and all that stuff, a lot of people were doing a lot of race conversations about race and things like that. And it was kind of everybody's the same. And people are like, no, don't take away my existence, right? We are different. And people are, which is cool. So it's nice to know those differences, but totally to know the similarities as well. Because we all, as humans, have way more in common than we have different, right? And so this is the same. So I love that question. Whenever in spaces like this, when we have the chance to kind of have some authentic, whether it be conversations, some authentic activities, and some authentic learning happening, I love kind of having the folks who weren't traditionally used to understanding the other folks, right? So the gen ed folks aren't used to having to understand the special ed folks, for them to think about the differences, but more importantly, the similarities, right? And I also love kind of the question of what things surprised you, because a lot of times when it happened in my class, it was like, oh, I'm really surprised that, students answered so many questions and they didn't get it right, and then they answered it, right? That was one of the things I talked about earlier in this thing, right? But I also have students, I'm really surprised at like how much the students like work with each other during the standard class period, right? Because in most regular classes, they weren't. And so these were the things that I said, all right, take that surprise and tell them, okay, you definitely learned some stuff about these folks. And keep that in mind when you're kind of making evaluations about people in the future. Everyone's going to surprise you, right? You can feel that you know all the things about people, but if you're not hanging with those people, you don't. And until you do, and you get surprised by them, and you see the things they love, the things they hate, the things that are different, and the things that are same from you, you're not going to start to then value them as your peers. And that's kind of what I want to happen with all of these things. The camps, the schools, heck, out in the world. I want us to not think, oh, like that person was special, I pity them, right? Like teachers do this to me currently. And it's like, I couldn't do what you do. Like, oh, you're a saint. I was like, why? I'm just teaching a bunch of awesome kids. It's great. You know what I mean? And when people are kind of looking at it that way, it is a kind of this pity, and that it kind of gives that hierarchy more room to breathe. And I wanted to eliminate that. And so once you start realizing, okay, there's a lot of positive stuff happening that we can learn from it, it becomes harder to feel like you are kind of in this upper caste, right? And ways people responded, ways they treated each other, like all of that stuff, motivation to learn, motivation to play. These are the kinds of questions that I think can bridge those gaps between regular ed and special ed. And by the way, like I said, I think I'm going to give this PowerPoint to the Wilderness Inquiry folks, but also just go ahead and take a picture if you want some of these questions, if you think these questions could apply to you outside of just a classroom setting, because like I said, I think all of you are not in a classroom setting, or most of you are not, but just these are the kinds of things that I feel help bridge the gap, right? Willingness to participate when they're sure, I talked about a lot. Students being helpful. Hello?
Are you there, Kareem? I think we got
lost
for a second.
I got thrown off. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I'm on my telephone now because my computer was like, Microsoft update, it's happening.
Oh no. Sorry.
So that actually was the last slide that I had to share. Cool there. And let me just, because I'm getting something on my screen. It's making it harder for me to see. Okay, so that was the last slide, but I just wanted to make sure that y'all did get a chance to see that, but I am going to send it out because it is super important. And like I said, bridging the gap, because for me, I feel like it's all about decentering all spaces so that we all just feel like a part of a whole. And my last slide was me resharing the quote at the end, because the quote is amazing. You know, for us to not center anyone, for us not to feel like we're inviting anyone in, for us, and essentially, like I said, for us not to feel like things are a caste system where there is a hierarchy of anything, so that whatever your space is, whether it is this you know, outdoor programming, camps, schools, those things can kind of be bridged with some of those questions I talked about, and that mindset of, you know, we can all learn from a variety of different folks, and it doesn't have to be people who kind of have a higher IQ than you or something like that, or a lower IQ than you.
Totally. That makes me think a little bit about something I heard recently about, you know, this phrase that we hear all the time about like having a seat at the table, or being like invited to have a seat at the table. And the like analysis, I think that's really important, is to think about like, why do you just automatically get the seat at the table? Like, who has decided that this is your table to own and invite people to? And I think that's something we think about a lot, especially when we're thinking about outdoor, you know, access and inclusion in outdoor spaces. This like rhetoric of, you got to invite diverse identities to the seat at the table when we're talking about who gets to spend time outside. And it's like, well, who's decided that you own that space? So it's interesting to kind of hear that too from the classroom side. I guess I never really thought about it that way, but that is like the, you know, when you think about kids growing up, learning how society works, like it, you know, is a pervasive thing at so many layers and levels.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about, I've been on a couple boards. I've never seen a person with a learning difference on a board. I've never seen a person on a learning difference like running right. And so, and when I went to, the funny thing is in Minnesota, right, when I went to that conference, it was like, oh, this is the first time I saw a keynote. Even though I've done a bunch of special ed conferences, right? A keynote who had special needs. This is the first time I saw a person leading a breakout session that had special needs. And that does something to the audience. And that says something about, you know, are we a true community? It's like, oh, here it felt like it was. Most spaces I'm in, it doesn't necessarily feel that way, right?
That's awesome. Thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to open it up for folks attending to see if they had questions or comments. We have a comment from the chat that says, I believe the Down Syndrome Association of Minnesota also has self-advocates on their board, which is pretty awesome. Feel free, folks, to just send something in the Q&A or use the chat, whatever works best for you. Otherwise, we'll keep the convo going. I know it takes a few awkwardly long pauses to get people to participate on Zoom, so we'll just kind of sit here for a second. And
I'll be so happy when all things are back in person, because the energy of a room is a big deal, right? It's just like,
definitely.
and also, and if I was in real life, my computer would not have restarted. So that would have never happened. I would have never glitched. But yeah, I love the in-person feel. But I think all of us need to think about the organizations we're running, the events we're holding, and thinking about special education. I know it's been tough lately and feeling like, who am I excluding? Am I excluding trans folks? Am I excluding Black folks, Native American? You know, I know it's all tough, but I think particularly when you are an agency doing something like that, right? Like for me, the thought of the Unified Special Olympics of Arizona not having a person with special needs on their board would be a travesty. You know, and I love that. I think somebody said, I think the Minnesota Down Syndrome Association has someone on their board. They're getting it right, and it's just at least something to consider, right? So, are you considering applicants like that? Are you saying, can we seek that out somehow? You know,
absolutely. I'm curious your thoughts, Kareem, on the concept of like affinity group spaces. I know for us and our organization, where we run integrated trips, throughout the summer. And we've been hearing a lot from other speakers too, talking about the importance of that like community of the affinity group space. And I think when we think about getting, the stepping stones, going from I've never camped before or I've never done X before to now I'm going to go do it with a bunch of people I've never met who also have so many different identities for me. Is that like do you feel like that would be a good stepping stone for folks to kind of get to that integrated, decentralized space?
I totally do. Yeah. That's funny that you bring that example. So my camp is run through my school, and now I'm the leader of that camp. I mentioned it earlier in my presentation, but it's like a social justice camp. We talk about all the things that kind of, typically separate people in life. And of course, ableism has become a big part of that. It always was a part. Now it's a big part because I'm running it. But, the thing about it is one thing we didn't have in terms of diversity is we still don't, because our school is in a place where 93% of the students in my school are Latinx, right? So, I truly have looked at every student in the school who is white, who is Black, who is Asian, who is Native American, mixed, to try and get those folks at our camp. But it's hard to do, right? Because our school is just, that's not it, right? It's like, it's hard to find those people at all in our school, let alone to go to the camp. And so our state does kind of the national version, which is called Anytown, or Anytown USA. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of it, but that is a national organization that has been going on since like the 1960s. And it is it's like building leaders, but it is on kind of that social justice type tip. And so I wound up going, right, one summer. And because they are national, they had people from all over the country. They had people from on all different levels of the gender scale. They had, they had the kind of diversity we didn't have in race, but also they had socioeconomic differences. So it was like, typically also the school I teach at is kind of like, I would say like a hard Title I. It is 100% free and reduced, actually, 100% free and reduced lunch. And so it is kind of a high poverty area. And we, and at that camp, it was a bunch of folks from my school because I invited them. And then there was kind of just a bunch of folks from like just middle class schools. And there was a bunch of folks from like the high income, private school type folks, right? And it was the thing that all of my students needed to see, because, the groups that are traditionally underrepresented also, though, need to drop their biases about the groups that are traditionally overrepresented, right? And so, I think that is a great step to any kinds of programming to figure out ways to do that.
Cool. Thank you. That's helpful with we're thinking about our future trip planning and our group mixes, and how do we reach kind of the the inclusive trip space. That's a challenge that we're working on. Any other questions or comments from the viewers? Feel free to send a message.
I met you at a conference. This is Karen Asana. I'm so appreciative. Is my goal. Nice. Love to hear it. I would say, and I think I said this at the conference, I don't know if because I did a breakout session and I did a keynote, but I would say, figure out a way to become good friends with the teacher at your schools, for all of y'all out there who are parents, right? It's so helpful in so many ways. One of the ways is that you can say to that teacher, hey, I'm building the schedule for my kid. Who are the teachers we should be looking for, right? And telling my student to go to their guidance counselor and try and get in those classes. That's one way that it's so helpful. And I think, so my school is massive, right? 3,000 folks, 3,000 kids and 180 teachers. And so obviously there's some teachers who are just so passionate and they'll do all the things for kids. And obviously there's some who are not, because you have 180 of them, right? And so having an inside, source is so helpful in that way. But the other way that it's helpful is in that, hey, the special ed teachers in our school, who maybe, you talk to, maybe they were they're not the most bold, or they have only been teaching for 1 year, and it's hard to get those folks to really kind of take the lead on a lot of things anyway, right? But it's a way to kind of get in there and be like, hey, what are some of the kinds of activities we're seeing, so that you can feel that, and then be able to, in an informed way, talk to then some, whether it be higher ups or even the teacher, and say, hey, there's some cool things that could be done that are not getting done, and our school is still looking like all the rest of the schools, and it would be so much better if our special education population was more of a part of our school.
It's great. I love the contributions to the chat. That's awesome.
You're welcome, Nicole.
So Kareem, we are an outdoor organization, so I have to ask, do you like to go camping?
Are y'all gonna be mad at me if I say I'm not into camping?
Absolutely not. Just curious.
So I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, then I moved to Wilmington, and they were just like kind of concrete jungle, right? And so so I wasn't used to, never went as a kid, right? And then, and I say this about dogs as well, because like most outdoor people also are like big dog people. I was like, oh, I never had one. It wasn't a thing. And so I went to Arizona, and then finally I get to Maryville, and so I told you about the camping thing, of course, right? And I was a teacher, and I was even stressed about that. I was like, I've never camped. I don't even know how to camp. I wouldn't know how to make a tent, right? And so, went and was like, man, the peacefulness of it was amazing. And that I really, so I do love camping when I'm there, right? I go there every year now, except of course 2020, because everything stopped. But I go camping every year there, and I have gone then camping on my own. But I feel like I always need people to like put it together for me. I feel like one of those like lousy husbands who say, oh, I don't know how to cook though, honey. I'm always like that guy. I don't know how to build a tent, and there are fires, and I don't know what food to bring. And so I would say that I'm not the hugest camper because I didn't grow up that way. But I love the outdoors though. And in Arizona, it is typically too hot to camp in the summertime, because like it's been 115 for like a week. But I do like going north, and that's where most of the camping is in Arizona, and it's cooler weathers and things like that. So yeah, I'm not opposed to camping. I'm just pretty novice.
Cool. Well, if you are ever around Minnesota in the summertime, Wilderness Inquiry would love to have you join us, even just for a day on the river with kids. I think it would be super, super fun.
That's up.
Great. Anything else from the group? We're at 8 o'clock, but if we wanted to ask one quick question or one quick comment, feel free to send it through. Otherwise, we will wrap up for tonight. Thank you so much, Kareem, for joining us. It was really great to hear your presentation, hear about you, and learn from you and your experience. We really appreciate having you on here. And for the rest of you watching, feel free to join us next month for our next inquiry series. We love to get to have these great conversations with folks. So everyone take care. Thanks again, Kareem. Have a great time with your family in New Jersey. And we'll hope to see you sometime soon.
Yes. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.